For the next few minutes, we want to focus on perhaps the most significant media story of the week, and that is how the Western media responded to the North Korean charm offensive in the opening days of the Winter Games in Pyeongchang, South Korea. With me now to talk about it and explain why we're seeing this type of response from the media and the larger impact it might have is Dr. Alan Mendoza. He is the executive director of the Henry Jackson Society in the United Kingdom, which is a leading human rights and international security organization. And, sir, thank you very much for being with us.
A great pleasure to be with you.
So we saw all these different headlines. Kim Jong-un's sister is stealing the show, CNN says. Reuters says she wins the diplomatic gold. The Washington Post says that she's the Ivanka Trump of North Korea, which I believe is the first positive Ivanka Trump reference from the Washington Post. And on it goes. Rave reviews for the cheer squad and so forth. Basically seen by the Western media, or at least a lot of it, as a tour de force. Why so quick to praise when the record of the Kim regime is pretty well known at this point?
Well, I think it's just an extraordinary example of the media getting carried away with itself. You're quite right to state the obvious. This is a repressive, highly repressive regime, the most repressive regime in the world by some accounts. North Korea is essentially a glorified prison camp. People are taken away for the sort of most subjective of things, locked away for life. Their children, grandchildren, locked away for life as well. In the same kind of way, you've had famine, you've had mismanagement, you've got control of information, all those things. And yet, the moment one of their leaders goes to the West, as it is in South Korea, essentially a Western liberal society, the Western media go mad. They forget all the bad and just focus on this appearance as if it's the most amazing thing in the world. So you're right to focus on it. What explains it? Well, I think there are two or three different reasons that's going on here. But the first is that the media you focused on, these people are desperate, absolutely desperate, to have a good luck story, a good news story from North Korea, rather than the remorseless drumbeat that we've been seeing over the past few months of North Korea as a nuclear weapons infractor. It looks at obviously threatening its neighbors. It's the greatest destabilizer in the world. What they would rather have is a story of, beautiful young woman comes to offer peace to the world, and nasty Americans say no. That's essentially what the story has been about in that kind of way, because the diplomatic winner, according to the newspapers, is North Korea, but the diplomatic loser is the US administration. And that's the flip side of this. You can't understand the former without seeing the latter side. There's sort of desperation to see, if you like, the US administration being on the wrong side of history here.
So do they believe that she's genuine in these efforts? Are they willing to be used? Are they just looking to get a dig in at the Trump administration? Why so quick to assume that she really has good intentions after all the rotten intentions we've seen for years?
Well, it's clearly the latter of those to start with. It is, let's have a dig at the Trump administration. Here we have, that the Trump administration has been very forceful in its condemnation of North Korea. It has been steadfast in its opposition to nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. And the first opportunity they have to turn on the administration, there they go and get it. But I do also think there's an element of naivety here. I think part of this, I said there are several reasons earlier. One of the reasons that some of the media has gone sort of gaga over this is because they want to believe that North Korea cannot be as bad as it actually is. They're desperate to believe it's the case. They can't possibly understand that these things actually happen in the world today, and they want to seize upon any moment to show that here's a positive and that things can change for the better. Another example of that was Iran, when the nuclear deal was happening with the Obama administration. The media was desperate to show that Iran could change, would change, and a deal would lead to that process. Of course, we've seen several years later, Iran hasn't changed at all, even if that deal is in place. And the same thing will happen in North Korea. So it's a question of, in a sense, going and looking at this and saying, we want this to be the case, let's make it the case by saying it is the case. But it's not the case.
What's the impact of the media, which gets a pretty wide audience when you consider all the broadcast and the print internet media, effectively glossing over these human rights atrocities? The spotlight is on the Korean Peninsula right now. There couldn't be a bigger disparity between what's going on in the South and what's going on in the North, and there are very obvious reasons for that. So for the media to ignore the atrocities, the poverty, the repression, the gulags, and all that, when there's an opportunity to really expose it, what's the impact worldwide, particularly on regimes that have tendencies in that direction, but perhaps haven't gone as far as the Kim regime.
Well, I think there are two sides to this. I think the first bit is that it's so obviously wrong what's been happening, and so obviously laughable, actually, that the media doing this has led, thankfully, to a major sort of backlash from sensible people who go, this isn't possibly the case. What are you talking about? Reality is so far skewed from the presentation that they've been making that most people out there are saying this is daft. And the fact we're having this conversation illustrates that fact as well. But there is a but, of course. The problem is that when you get a drumbeat of this sort of thing, when you see that any move, however ridiculous, is applauded in the West and seen as being a major move forwards, it will encourage other regimes, other human rights violators, to think that here we go, we can oppress our citizens, we can commit human rights abuses, we can threaten international security. But it's all okay as long as we can send our leader's sister along to a set-piece occasion and pretend that we want peace in that way. This isn't the first time this has happened in history. We've seen many cases, obviously, of bad regimes, going back to the Nazis, before that even, of course, using diplomatic initiatives to cover up what they were really doing elsewhere. And we fought for it every time. So there is a clear moral here, which is don't fall for this. Actually go and focus a spotlight on the regime and look at its infractions, and that's going to get much more reaction from it than the applause that it's been getting in the last week.
A couple of minutes left in our conversation with Dr. Alan Mendoza of the Henry Jackson Society. And sir, how accommodating has South Korea been here? Have they been too accommodating, I guess, is the question. It's one thing to let the regime that wants to conquer you to come to the Olympics. It's another thing to enter the arena together. It's another thing to have a joint women's hockey team. It almost appears that the South Koreans think if they're really, really nice to North Korea, maybe they'll actually be nice to us.
Well, I think you're again right to highlight this particular aspect of it. I think we've all been disappointed by the way the South Koreans have really rolled out the red carpet. Now, look, I want to start from a position. I'm not a Korean, obviously. I understand entirely the way that the South Koreans have been feeling over the past few years, under threat, constant threat of missile attack, other attacks, kind of hostility from the north, the threat this could end up in a nuclear engagement or Seoul being reduced to rubble. That's going to have a psychological impact on people. But this is where I think countries have to look at the impact of what they're doing. It's undoubtedly the case that the united front shown by neighbors in the region and by the US to North Korea's antics has led North Korea to this point where it feels it has to try something else and do that. The correct way to respond to that different approach is to, by all means, welcome an approach, but to hold the regime to account, to say, you're still the same regime you were a month ago, 2 months ago, a year ago. Nothing has changed, essentially. Let's not forget that, and we should be focusing our attention on that aspect rather than what we've just done.
Well, that's certainly the case. And Dr. Mendoza, unfortunately, our time is up. But I think you're right about the backlash having a critical role here as well. And perhaps a lot of things that were highlighted in the backlash wouldn't have happened if the media hadn't been so irresponsible. But nonetheless, the irresponsibility continues as well. So thank you, sir, very much for your time today.
Pleasure to be with you.
Dr. Alan Mendoza, Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society in the UK.